Today we're going to look at a story out of Mark chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 21 through 43. This is a story about two desperate people. A man named Jairus, who was a synagogue ruler in a small town around the Sea of Galilee, and a woman who had had an issue of blood for 12 years. And we're going to look at the healing of both of these stories and how they interrelate. So I'm going to read the text, and I'm going to tell you the story and fill in some of the details, and then we'll have some application at the end. So let's begin and read this story together, beginning in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by the boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. She told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, came. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. I want to just begin by telling you the story based on what it might look like back in those days. I want you to imagine a small town around the Sea of Galilee in Israel. These towns could range anywhere from 200 to 500 to maybe 1,000 people in size, so they were very small towns. Everyone knew everyone, and of course the most important figure in town was the synagogue ruler, Jairus. He's the most influential man in town, probably one of the wealthiest men in town. And so this little fishing village, it's centered around the synagogue, and the synagogue centered around Jairus. And so he carried a lot of weight in this little town. And the whole town knew that his little girl was sick. At some point, he had either seen Jesus heal or had heard enough about Jesus healing that he believed that Jesus had the power to heal his daughter. And Jairus was at his wit's end because he knew his daughter was at the point of death. And so as Jesus comes into town, and you can imagine in these little villages, everyone comes out to see Jesus when he comes into town. So everyone, the witnesses to this are the entire village. So let's just assume it's 200 or 300 people. All 200 or 300 people have come out, and they see Jairus, their leader, their spiritual leader, who they look to, come and bow at Jesus' feet and say, "Jesus, please heal my daughter. She is sick and she's not going to get better. Would you please heal her?" And it's interesting to me because think about what Jairus had to lose. Now, he is a Pharisee. His friends are Jesus' enemies. He is going to be responsible in some way, he and the Pharisee party, for crucifying Jesus later on. Jesus' ministry kind of flew in the face of Jairus and everything about Jairus and his ministry. And so they were not best of friends, and yet Jairus knew, I'm going to put my job on the line, I'm going to put my career on the line, I'm going to put my reputation on the line, I'm going to put my money on the line and my authority on the line and my influence on the line. But the one thing he loved in life more than his power and authority and influence and career was his little girl. And so he's so desperate for the life of his little girl that he's willing to take the risk and step out of this crowd and put everything on the line to fall before Jesus' feet and get healing for his daughter. So this man takes a huge risk in falling at Jesus' feet. And it's not like he does it in private. He does it for the whole community to see. And so they begin to walk to his house. And it's interesting to me how Jesus responds, because Jesus doesn't in any way say, no, I'm not willing to do this. You are my enemy. Why would I help you? You haven't helped me. Your friends are my enemies. He doesn't say any of that. All Jesus cares about, because he's not a respecter of persons, all Jesus cares about is the fact that Jairus had faith. And when Jesus sees Jairus' faith, he says, absolutely, I will help you. And so Jesus goes and helps Jairus. And so they're walking to Jairus' house to heal his daughter when this woman comes and touches the hem of his garment, or the edge of his garment. Now let me explain to you a little bit about what was going on in this situation. This woman is the exact opposite of Jairus. She is an outsider. If you'll remember, when you read the Old Testament law, if a woman was on her period and she was bleeding, she was considered ceremonially unclean and was not allowed to go to the synagogue. So here's a woman that for 12 years has been bleeding, and she's been considered ceremonially unclean. So at some point, she was not allowed to go to the synagogue anymore. You know, what they did in these little towns is if someone had a disease, and it could be leprosy, it could be anything they thought might be given to other people or be unclean, they would usually put them outside the city. So she was probably living outside this little village. If she was married, she had no intimacy with her husband because she had been bleeding for 12 years. Think about the identity of women in that culture. She was not able to have children because of this, and so her identity was attacked because of this disease. So her life was already over. She had no intimacy. Her identity was affected. This had just ruined her life, destroyed her life, and she had not been to the synagogue to worship God in 12 years. And we don't know how long Jairus was the synagogue ruler, but think about who would declare her unclean and not allow her to come back to the synagogue. The synagogue ruler. Jairus may have been the one that told this woman 12 years earlier, you can't come to the synagogue. And so there's this tension between the most influential man in town. We're going to his house to heal his daughter, and yet one of the outsiders, this woman who is unclean, who can't come into town and not allowed to touch anyone, because if she touches anyone, they are unclean. She is so desperate. She's as desperate as Jairus is. So she puts everything on the line too. She doesn't have as much to lose, but she could be humiliated again and again and again. So the last thing she ever wants is to be noticed, because she doesn't want to be humiliated again as she had been so many times. And so in her mind, she's thinking, if I can just sneak through the crowd, I'm not even supposed to be here. I'm not even supposed to be in town. I'm not supposed to be near these people. If I touch them, they'll be unclean. So I'm just going to sneak through the crowd, and I'm just going to touch the hem of his garment and sneak back out, and I will be healed, and then I can have my life back. Well, the plan works really well, and she does touch him, and she is healed, and she's got to be rejoicing until Jesus turns around and says, who touched me? And of course, his disciples are saying, what are you talking about? People are bumping into you from all over. It's crowded in these streets. Why are you even asking that question? But Jesus says, I felt the power come out of me. I know someone touched me. And finally, knowing that she can't get away with it, this woman comes, and she, just like Jairus, falls on her face before him, and it says, trembling with fear. Trembling with fear. Imagine the fear in her eyes. She's going to be humiliated again. Jesus is going to be upset. You can just imagine what is running through her mind. I have interrupted the most important man in town and his daughter. So there's a lot of tension built up here, and yet Jesus offers her what? Mercy and grace and forgiveness. He says, daughter, your faith has healed you. And think about everything now that is happening in her life. She's going to get to move back into town. If she's young enough, she's going to be able to have children again. If she has a husband, she's going to be able to be intimate again. She's going to be able to go back to the synagogue. And so think about how drastically her life is changed by this one event. And it's just huge. I mean, you can't imagine how her life has just been changed for the better. But her life has been changed for the better. But who's the most influential man in town? Jairus. And these people walk up and say, Jairus, don't bother the teacher anymore. This interruption, while he was taking care of this woman, your daughter died. And imagine how this woman feels. Oh no, what's going to happen to me? How are they going to respond to me? And yet Jesus just turns to Jairus and just ignores them and says, Jairus, listen to me. Don't pay attention to your circumstances. Don't pay attention to what your friends say. Don't pay attention to what the world around you is saying. You just listen to me. You have faith. You have faith. Your daughter will be healed today. So just ignore the voices around you. Ignore the white noise around you in the world and just focus on me. And so they begin to walk to Jairus' house. And when they get to Jairus' house, of course, his house is full of people who are now mourning, and they're crying for this girl who's dead. And of course, who are Jairus' friends? The other Pharisees, which know about Jesus and are suspicious of Jesus, and they're not Jesus' best friends and biggest supporters. And they come out and they hug Jairus and say, we're so sorry, your daughter is dead, and they're crying and weeping. And Jesus says, why are you guys making such a commotion? She's not dead, she's just asleep. And they laugh at him because of the ridiculousness of his comment, because they have already confirmed that she is dead. And so notice what Jesus does. He only takes the people with faith, Peter, James, and John, and Mr. and Mrs. Jairus. He takes the 5 of them. He kicks everyone else out. He goes in and he performs this miracle and raises this girl up. And they are astonished at the miracle. And then notice what he says. He says, don't tell anyone, because of course he is managing the time frame to his death. He doesn't want the story to get out too early, and there's too much commotion, too much stir about this, because he knows he's got to die on Passover in another 2 years, and so he doesn't want this to stir up too quickly. And then he says, give her something to eat. And let me tell you why I think he did that. Jewish people were very superstitious, especially about ghosts. Remember when Jesus came out on the lake and the disciples thought it was a ghost? They believed in ghosts. The reason he wanted them to feed her is because they could say, well, she's dead, and that's just her ghost. As soon as they feed her, they recognize this girl really is alive. And so that's what Jesus is saying there when he says, give her something to eat. So this is just an amazing story. Think about the tension if you were one of the townspeople there that day. Your leader of the whole city bowing before Jesus, knowing what he's putting on the line. This woman who is an outcast putting everything on the line to touch Jesus, both desperate people. While she does that and the interruption causes the parade to stop, in the meantime, the daughter dies, and it looks like the story is over, and yet Jesus comes and raises this girl from the dead. It's just a miraculous, incredible story about the power of Jesus and the way his compassion and the way he dealt with these two people. It's just a beautiful story of the love and the mercy and the grace of Jesus and the faith of two people who were willing to put it all on the line and take a risk for Jesus Christ. And so what I want to give you here today is I want to give you some application to this story, because I think really there's 5 applications that we can learn from this story that I think are very, very important. Number 1 is Jesus is the great equalizer. Jesus is the great equalizer. These two people had nothing in common but their faith, right? Their desperation drove them to take a huge risk, and their faith resulted in their healing. Jairus is an insider, the woman is an outsider. Jairus is a man, the woman is obviously a woman. And they're just very, very different. But the one thing they have in common is they're desperate for Jesus. And don't miss this about understanding this about Jesus Christ. This is one of the big takeaways from this story. Jesus is not a respecter of persons. He doesn't care about color of skin. He doesn't care about economic status. He doesn't care if you live in a mansion or are homeless. He doesn't care if you have children or you don't, if you're married or you're single, what sins you've committed in the past or haven't committed in the past. Jesus doesn't care about any of that. He cares about one thing. Are you willing to take the risk, to step out of the crowd? And are you desperate enough to fall at his feet? And if you have a little bit of faith and a whole lot of desperation, Jesus says, I don't care who you are. I just want to change your life. And so I think that's one big takeaway from this story that's really, really important. Second takeaway is this. You need to resist the temptation to make excuses. You need to resist the temptation to make excuses. Look at verses 25 and 26 in your Bibles here. Look at this. Here are some of the excuses that this woman could have used. I'm lost in the crowd. She could have just said, you know what, the crowd's too big. I can't get to Jesus. She could say, it's been so long. Did you notice it's been 12 years? It's been too long. No healing could happen to me now. It's just been too long. 3, she could have said, I've been disappointed so many times. It says that she's seen doctors over and over and over again, and yet they couldn't heal her. She could just say, you know what? He can't heal me either. I've been to every doctor. There's no use in trying anymore. 4, it's been so long, and I don't have the resources anymore. And so she could say, you know what? I've exhausted all my resources, and because it's been so long, and because the doctors couldn't heal me, and I don't have any resources to pay Jesus, I'm not going to bother him with his time. She could have used that excuse. She could have used the excuse, things are getting worse and not better. This is just a worsening condition, and it's not ever going to get better. There's 1,000 reasons that or excuses that she could have had for not stepping out of the crowd and doing this, and yet she had one reason, and that was her desperation. And she just wanted to be healed so bad. She wanted to be healed worse than all the risk involved in stepping out. And I want you to hear that, because you know what? I know a lot of people who make excuses about God. I've done too much. I've been away too long. God can't love a person like me. The excuses can go on and on and on and on. I'm too bad. I can't have my life changed. I don't have enough money. I feel uncomfortable at church. I don't understand the Bible. I don't know enough. I don't have my act together. There's 1,000 excuses on why you don't want to be desperate enough to let Jesus Christ change your life. But let me tell you something. When you do get to that point of desperation that you're willing to take that risk, Jesus says, I am ready at any point to change your life. So don't make excuses for your faith. Don't make excuses for your faith. Step out of the crowd. And that leads us to the third application that is so important, and it is this. Jesus' power is available to anyone. Do you believe that? Jesus' power is available to anyone, but it is accessible only to those who step out of the crowd. Jesus' power is available to anyone. His power is available. But who received power that day? The 2 people willing to step out of the crowd. Here's the point. This story tells us that we need to take some risks with our faith. We need to take some risk with our faith. We need to be willing to step out of the crowd. We need to be willing to say, you know what, God, I don't understand you and I don't understand what you're all about, but I'm willing to take a risk for you. And when we take risks for God, remember this, when we take risks for God in our faith, He always rewards us. He always rewards us. So I want you to learn to take risk for your faith. That is so, so important. Think about Jairus. His friends are saying, your daughter's dead. Circumstances would dictate his daughter's dead. Science would tell him, your daughter's dead. The coroner would tell him, your daughter's dead. And yet here's what Jesus is saying. Don't pay attention to your circumstances. Don't pay attention to what your friends are telling you. Don't pay attention to what the facts are telling you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to trust in me. Trust in me. Don't listen to your friends. Don't listen to the noise. Don't listen to the quote facts. Just listen to me and live by faith. And if you'll be desperate enough to take a risk for me and step out, then what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you a great blessing, and you're going to see my power displayed in your life because you were willing to listen to me and not the crowd. I want you to think about this in my own life. I believe that Jesus' power is available to anyone. Okay, I think it's available to me, and I think it's available to you. I think sometimes we don't see His power work because we're not taking the risk to step out of the crowd to make it accessible to us. I wonder how many times in my life, in my faith walk, I've played it safe, where Jesus has said, listen, ignore the crowd, ignore what the world is saying, and trust me and watch my power at work in your life. And I think there's been so many times where I've said, you know what, God, that sounds great, but I'm so nervous and I'm so scared. I think this time I'm just going to play it safe. And have you ever heard the phrase, you don't know what you don't know? And I don't know what I missed in the power of God because I played it safe. See, I think what happens to many of us is we don't see the power of God at work in our lives very much. And the reason we don't see the power is because we're not willing to take the risk. But because we're not willing to take the risk, we don't see what we're missing. And so we just think God isn't a very powerful God, when reality is God is a very powerful God, and He's ready for you, and He's ready to work on your behalf, and He's ready for you to see His power displayed. But it's only accessible when you're willing to take the risk. And most of us don't take faith risks, and that's why we don't see the power of God displayed. So I'm going to ask you, start taking risk with your faith. Step out of the crowd And I think what you're going to see is God, you're going to see the power of God displayed because he always, always blesses those who step out in faith. And so be willing to take some risk with your faith. You don't know what you don't know. Try it once and see what the power of God looks like in your life. Okay? Number 4, very important application, is sometimes Jesus waits to act until we are ready to accept. Sometimes Jesus waits to act until we are ready to accept. I want you to think about this. He waits till the girl dies, and Jairus has to get to that place before he acts. Have you ever heard the phrase, Jesus, he always is on time, but he's never early? I think that is so true in our lives. Here's what happens. In our flesh, we have a tendency to want God to come and rescue us or come and act on our behalf early in the process. But when we do, what ends up happening is instead of God getting the glory, we get the glory. We take credit. If we're playing the football game and God shows up in the second quarter and wins the game for us, then we walk around going, yes, we won the game. But when we're down 2 touchdowns with 30 seconds left, then God shows up and boy, it's all about God, right? Well, that's what happens in our lives. Is sometimes he waits till the very, very end, till we've gotten to the end of ourselves, to where we've tried everything ourselves, and we're so desperate we say, if God doesn't show up, we're done, and that's when God shows up. My guess is Jairus had exhausted every other option. I know that the woman had exhausted every other option, all of her money and all the doctors. And after every other option, they went to Jesus, and Jesus says, you know what? I'm going to let you go to the very end of your rope, so when you see me act, you'll know it was me. Now, what I would like to encourage you to do is, why don't you start going to Jesus first instead of all the other options first? But know that Jesus waits till we're ready to give him the glory, give him the credit, give him our lives before he acts. And so, if you want a little easier life, don't exhaust all your other options first. Don't run out of your flesh first and then come to God. Come to God first with absolute submission, absolute humility, knowing that he's going to get the glory. And I think you'll see God working in your life in powerful, powerful ways. But sometimes he has to wait till I get to the end of myself before he's ready to act. He always shows up on time, but he is rarely early. And that leads me to the 5th application, and that is sometimes our best ministry is in our interruptions. Sometimes our best ministry is in our interruptions. Here's what I mean by that. That woman interrupted him on the way to Jairus' daughter, and that was one of his best ministry moments and one of the most famous stories in all the Gospels. Well, it's the same way with us. Listen, ministry opportunities never come at our convenience. They always come at the most inopportune times. Our kids don't ask those life-changing questions, those teachable moments where we need to stop. They never come at our convenience. They never come when we're doing nothing. They come when we're right in the middle of something, and then we have a tough choice to make. Am I going to put them off, or am I going to stop and talk to them right then when they are attentive? Because let me tell you something about your kids. Your most important conversations with your kids will never come on your timing when you're ready. They come on their timing when they're ready. And if you don't take advantage of them, you lose those opportunities forever. And it's never going to come at a convenient time. So what you've got to begin to do is ask God to show you the wisdom to know what's an interruption and what's a ministry opportunity. Because with your kids, with coworkers, with neighbors, with your spouse, with a good friend, sometimes they're interrupting you at the most inopportune times, but that may be the time when you do your best ministry. And so don't always just put off interruptions as interruptions. Learn to discern what is a legitimate interruption and what is a great ministry opportunity. And that's part of what we need to do as we reflect the nature of Christ to other people. So that is a great story out of Mark chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some application about it. I hope that you learn to take risk with your faith. I hope you'll get desperate with your faith, because it's in that desperation. It's getting to the end of ourselves. It's taking that risk where we see the most powerful work of God displayed in our lives.